Well, good afternoon to everybody. This is, as you know me, this is a great new adventure for me. I've done the Raleigh Trolley about 50 times, but I've never actually recorded it and done it with a PowerPoint. So we're going to do our best to see if I can keep up with all the information and show you some pretty wonderful slides that we've taken. We're doing this because of the coronavirus and because of the orders by the state that we cannot all meet at the universities, and so everything is going online. So that's also a great new adventure. So climb aboard the Great Raleigh Trolley for our adventure today. There's a reason that I do this. Everybody thinks it's a very cool signature activity for my class, and I think it is too, but there are some underlying reasons that we take this trolley adventure. First of all, you remember that the two questions that kids are trying to answer, and in fact all of us are trying to answer, is who am I and what's my place in the world? So by doing the development theory work that we've done, we're trying to address the who am I question, and for you all to know who these middle schoolers are and the various development theories that control the way they behave and they develop. But the next thing we have to look at is what's my place in the world? So I believe that it's incredibly important for any teacher to know the community in which he or she is teaching. So I think it's important for all of us to go around Raleigh and point out, besides the history of Raleigh, the areas from which children are going to come to the various schools. Now, regarding the history of Raleigh, I feel it's important that you're the keeper of the history of Raleigh, as well as teaching your kids about the history of Raleigh so they too can be the keepers of the history of Raleigh. If we don't teach the younger children about the value of the city in which we live, then they're not going to understand why it's so important to be citizens of the capital city. So let's get started. First of all, there's a misconception that the city of Raleigh, or that the state of North Carolina was developed by a lot of people getting in these very small boats and coming across the Atlantic to settle North Carolina. And in fact, some did. But you'll remember the geography of North Carolina. If you look at the coastal area, there's that wonderful area where everybody vacations, and it's called the Barrier Islands. And they're called the Barrier Islands for a reason. One, they're a barrier when very bad weather comes, and so it doesn't hit the main part of North Carolina, that the Barrier Islands take it first, and so it's a barrier to the bad weather. But it also tended to be a barrier for those people who were coming from England and the continent, because of all the sandbars and the treacherous area that they had to navigate. They don't call that area the graveyard of the Atlantic for nothing. And many ships were lost. And so actually most of the citizens that settled North Carolina came from the north, which would have been Virginia, and then came up from the south, from South Carolina. And I should put in here that if you have your notes that were in your red folder about the trolley adventure, you can essentially follow what I'm going to be saying as we go along on this trip. So anyway, we've got the people that are coming from the north, coming from the south, and they tended to go to the middle part of the state of North Carolina, which is about where Raleigh is, and they tended to be really wild. Now that's the men. The women were not. They were diligent workers. They took care of the children. They took care of the crops. They took care of the meat. They took care of everything. But the men had a reputation of being very wild and unruly. And so what the governor of North Carolina decided to do was to establish a county in this middle area, because if you had a county, you could have a county seat, you could have a court that was held quarterly, and guess what? You could have jails. And so those people who were misbehaving could be taken care of. So they pulled some land from Johnston County, from Cumberland County, and from Orange County, and they made up Wake County. And so great, we had the middle part of the state taken care of, the wild men under control. But the problem was there was still no capital of North Carolina. And so the governor decided that they had to establish a capital. And they really, because it was such a large and long state, they decided that Raleigh would be, that the center part of the state would be a good place for the capital. And so they made a motion for Wake County, that Wake would be the capital, and that was in 1788. And it was a very peculiar motion. They had that the capital had to be placed 10 miles, within 10 miles of Isaac Hunter's Tavern. Now, Isaac Hunter's Tavern is gone, and its location is the North Raleigh Hilton. So if you're trying to figure out where it used to be. But why did they decide they wanted to make the capital within 10 miles of Isaac Hunter's Tavern? Well, those of you that know your history pretty well, or those of you that even don't, know that back in the day, and we're talking about the 1700s, there was no Motel 6. And when people traveled, and if they had a journey that had to take them some distance, they had to have a place to stay. And the whole series of taverns that were developed in North Carolina, besides having the beer and spirits or whatever down below, they also had sleeping accommodations up above. Now, when you made an arrangement to stay up above in one of these beds, you actually just got one sleeping space. So you didn't really know who you'd be sharing a bed with. It wouldn't really fly today, but back in the day, you just bought one space. And so anyway, they decided they wanted to have this capital around Isaac Hunter's Tavern, so that when people came in, when the legislature came in, there would be places for them to stay, and then they would meet in whatever Capitol building they established. So in 1792, they okayed an appointment of commissioners to come to this area and ride around the area and find about 1,000 acres. They wanted 600 acres for just surrounding, and about 400 acres for the town. So they tasked these guys with, and again, it was men, tasked these guys with finding the land for the capital. And so they came up here at March 20th, 1792, and they rode all around the area. They rode to 17 different sites. And think about this. They were on horseback. There were no roads. There were just trails. And they were trying to find the best place for the capital. Well, they were pretty exhausted. They were probably staying at Isaac Hunter's Tavern. And they happened to meet a gentleman named Joel Lane. And Joel Lane invited these guys to his house for dinner. And when they came to his house for dinner, he served them his signature drink, which was called Cherry Bounce. Now, obviously it was made of cherries. The bounce part of it was the alcoholic content that this drink had. And so after a long time of riding these sites and then enjoying themselves at Isaac Hunter's Tavern, at Joel Lane's house, Joel Lane happened to mention that he happened to have 1,000 acres for sale, and that he'd be more than happy to sell these acres to the men that had come to look for a site, and he would sell them for $2,756. Well, I don't know if it was the cherry bounce or the collegiality of the men. They decided their job was done. They'd found the perfect spot, and so they bought the 1,000 acres from Joel Lane. The next step was to have William Christmas, who lived in Franklin County, which is just north of Wake County, come and lay out this plot of land so that they could determine where the city would be, where the buildings would be, where the residential area would be, etc., etc. They did have what they called a grand center, which was 6 acres. And you can see it today. If you go to the Capitol building, that whole area where the monuments are was called the Grand Center. But one of the things that was really important was there were going to be 4 other public squares. There was Nash, there was Caswell, there was Burke, and then there was Moore Square. And those were always supposed to remain public. Nothing could be built on them that the public could not use. So they laid out the Grand Square, and they laid out the four public squares. And one of the coolest things, I think, is if you look at the map, if you look at a map of the city, you will see that there's Edenton Street, you'll see that there's Fayetteville Street, there's Halifax, there's New Bern, and there's Hillsborough Street. So if you were to get on Hillsborough Street and you continued all the way west on Hillsborough Street, you would actually come to Hillsborough. If you got on Fayetteville Street and you started going south, you would eventually end up in Fayetteville. Halifax, if you went north, you would end up in Halifax. And New Bern, if you're going to go to the beach, you start out and you go down New Bern Avenue before you turn off on the superhighways. And New Bern, if you were to keep on the old road, you would get to New Bern. So they established the names of some of these roads based on the direction in which they were heading and where you would end up. All right, long story short, they finally decided on December the 31st, 1792, the legislature ratified this land and they named the capital city Raleigh. Now remember, Raleigh never came to the New World. He sent groups over that he financed on ships to settle, but Raleigh never came. But anyway, the city, our capital city, was named Raleigh. Okay, so that's the start of the history of North Carolina and Raleigh. Many of you are going to be familiar with this first slide that you're going to see, and that's the Mordecai House. The Mordecai plantation is one of two large plantations that were in Raleigh. It was served by enslaved people. It was an agriculture plantation. There were 5,000 acres, and on these 5,000 acres, they grew wheat, they grew corn, and they grew cotton. Now, it's kind of interesting, the crops that they had. The cotton crop was perhaps the most popular crop among landowners and those who held enslaved people. And if you think about it, and here's where you're going to use your Piaget concrete reasoning, think about the size of a corn field, and then the size of the corn that's in the cornfield, and think about the size of a cotton plant. If you were an enslaved person hoping to get your freedom by running away, would you have a better chance hiding out in a cornfield, or would you have a better chance hiding out in a cotton field? And actually, for those people who had enslaved people, they felt that they could keep an eye on their property, meaning the people, better if the people were farming cotton. It makes a lot of sense. It's not right, but it makes a lot of sense. Moses Mordecai was the second owner of the Mordecai plantation. And when you look at the slide, you're going to see the big front part of the house. That was actually added on. The original part of the Mordecai house is if you go around and look up the right-hand side, you'll see the original part of the house. They added the second part on because in those days, a lot of families came to live together. And Moses Mordecai, he had one wife who died in childbirth, and then Moses married her sister. And of course, you didn't have eHarmony in those days, so they married the people that they knew. He married his first wife's sister. They had several children. Many family members came to live at the Mordecai plantation, and so they added on to the house. So there you can see the Mordecai plantation as we see it today. All right, if we were on the trolley, we would be leaving the parking lot of the Mordecai house, and we'd be coming around the corner. We'd be going down Peace Street, and you're going to see Peace College. And this is a great picture of Peace College. Peace College served during the Civil War as the Confederate hospital. And if you'll look at that building, let me give you a better shot here. Let's get this last shot. If you look to the third floor, that's the main administrative building. If you look to the third floor, that's where they had the morgue. The hospital floors were the first two floors, and the third floor was actually the morgue. And Peace College students today will say that if you go on that third floor at night, you can actually hear moaning and then stillness where they kept all the dead soldiers. So I'm sure it's just a story, but Peace likes to talk about it. Peace College is a university now. It's Peace University. It was started out by a Raleigh business person. It was a two-year college at one point for women, and recently has become a four-year college for it's co-ed, and then even more recently has become a university. It is their plan to become a center for technology and online courses. They were very lucky to get Dr. Lori McLaren, who used to work at the College of Education in Technology in Poe Hall, and the piece was able to hire her away. And so she is now heading up their effort to become a major university that is all online. They do have classes, but their online presence is huge. Okay, so let's move along. If we were in the trolley, you would see that we'd be going up, and we would see the legislative building on the left-hand side, and we'd see the Daily Planet, the science building, on the right-hand side, and then we'd come to Capitol Square, and this is the Capitol building. It is, in fact, the second Capitol building. The first Capitol building was called the Doghouse. It was very unattractive, and the legislators asked Thomas Jefferson what they could do to spruce this up. Now, this one's pretty good looking, but the other one was just square and unattractive, and Thomas Jefferson said, "You guys need to get in touch with Canova in Italy. He's a great sculptor, and have him sculpt a marble statue to put in the center of the building." And so they did. And Jefferson said, "And don't worry about the price. I'm sure you can afford it." So they went ahead and got in touch with Canova, and Canova did sculpt a statue of George Washington, and it was shipped over. And imagine back in the day what this must have taken. A marble statue that weighed tons, shipped over to North Carolina, came in at in New Bern or something, or one of the coastal towns, and then it was brought by carriage to Capitol Square, and it was installed. It was installed in the Capitol building. Okay, so sorry, we need to stop for a sip of water. So they installed this wonderful piece by Canova in the Capitol building, and everybody looked at it and they said, "Oh my gosh, it looks like George Washington is in his bathrobe." In fact, the statue, and I'm not showing you a picture because I actually want you to see it yourself. The statue has George Washington sitting in a chair, a very large, big chair, and he's penning a farewell address to his troops. He's retiring. In fact, he's wearing a toga. And the reason that this was that it was carved this way was because at that point that was the style that they were using. They were using a Renaissance style. A Greek Revival type style, and everything looked like it was either Roman or Greek, and they got used to it, and they still said that he looked like he was in his bathrobe, but they got used to it. They thought it really classed up the place. But one chronologically gifted woman said to the group, I think we ought to put wheels on it. What would happen if ever the Capitol building were to burn? Well, frankly, I don't know what kind of wheels they could have put on it for the kind of weight that this thing carried. Maybe logs underneath that they could push it along. But anyway, they said, no, that's too undignified. We don't want to have that. So they went along with this beautiful statue in the center of the building. They felt better about this ugly old building that was their Capitol that they had nicknamed the Doghouse. And they did have a dome on it, and it was leaking. So they hired a tinker, and that was somebody who would solder the pieces of metal together was called back in the day. They hired a tinker to come and resolder some of the leaks in the dome. So he came and he put his fire pot, which was how they did it. They had to heat the metal up, the metal solder up, so that they could apply it to where the cracks were. He put it on the window ledge, the wooden window ledge. Decided he was just really too hungry to get started on such a big job, and so he left it there and he went out to get something to eat. Well, as you might expect, this isn't rocket science. A wind came up, blew the fire into the Capitol, and the Capitol building started on fire. and it spread very, very rapidly. They called out the fire brigades, but there was not much they could do. They were able to save the Speaker's chair, the Gilbert Stuart painting of George Washington, and some books from the library, and that was about it. And then all of a sudden there was a call that the dome was going to fall, and everybody had to get out of the building. Now, what's very neat is that 200 years after Raleigh was founded, Raleigh had its bicentennial, and I was the education consultant for the city and authored a book for teachers about the capital city, and I got passages from various private diaries about the burning of the Capitol. And one of them describes the picture. The person lived nearby. He saw the Capitol on fire. He came and witnessed it burning, and he said you could look through the windows and it looked like George Washington was in hell. There was fire and red flames all around him. The crystal chandeliers were dripping from above, and the white marble just looked, it was so stunning. And then all of a sudden the dome fell, and it cracked the statue. So the statue was lost. It was buried under the debris, and it was lost. They knew immediately that they had to rebuild this statue. Rebuild the Capitol building, because other cities would say, well, you don't have the Capitol building anymore. Maybe you don't need the Capitol there. We need to move the Capitol. So they started out to rebuild the Capitol building, and they brought the rock, the Capitol building that you see now, they brought all the stone from Rock Quarry Road. And at that time, they had to put a railroad track in, and the railroad would carry the cars would carry the stone that they were going to use during the week. And then on the weekends, the people could take rides on the train. The quarry was about 1.5 miles from the Capitol building. It is a Greek Revival style. The new Capitol building is Greek Revival. It costs $533,000 to rebuild, and everybody thinks it's absolutely beautiful. Now, I want to talk just for a moment about fires in the capital city. You'll know that most of the buildings back in the day, we're talking about the 1700s, 1800s, were mostly built of wood, so that any time that a fire started in one building, it would very quickly go on to the next building. And they did have fire brigades, and they were pumpers. They would pump the water out. And one time there was a fire, and the hose split. Now, the streets in the capital city were red clay, just like everything else is red clay around here. And the water mixed with the red clay, and it mixed with the red dirt, and it formed like clay. And the firefighters were smart enough, there was enough distance from one building to the one that was going to next start on fire. They threw handfuls of this red clay against the building that was going to catch on fire next. And that made it impervious to the fire. It was just like brick. And so the fire did not spread. They were called from that point on the Mud Brigade. So that's the story about the fires and the Capitol building. And let's move on to the next. So if you're in Capitol Square, you're going to see a lot of monuments. There are many, many monuments that have been put up, and a couple of them are very controversial. And they're controversial in North Carolina. They're controversial throughout the South. This is the obelisk that honors the Confederate dead. And then we also have, and let me get to the next one, we've also got a monument that honors Confederate women. And you can see this woman sitting here with a Bible in her hand and a young son right next to her with a sword, looking that he might go forward into war. It's important that we talk a little bit about these statues right now, and the controversy that comes along with the statues that were built after 1900. And there are a number of them. Of the 53 Confederate statues that are in public squares right now, only 6 of them were built and erected before 1902. We all know that the the Civil War is called by various names, the War of Great Unpleasantness, the war between the states, etc., etc. But it was lost by the South. The North won the Civil War, and the South lost. But the South, I believe, was determined not to lose the way of life that they had come to know. And that way of life was very discriminatory against African Americans. And so the belief is now, and the many educated people have studied this, and the statues that were erected after 1900 were not necessarily memorializing just the Confederate dead and those people who fought in the war, but instead were more a statement of control and intimidation for the African Americans that remained in the South. These were called the Jim Crow years, and it was when we had two separate bathroom facilities. We had different water fountains, some for whites, some for blacks. Voting, though the Emancipation Proclamation had given blacks freedom and they had the right to vote, there was a literacy test that was given, there was a poll tax that was put on, things that would stop blacks from voting. Theaters had balconies that only allowed that the blacks had to sit in. Whites could sit down below in the more comfortable part. And so when we're considering these issues about what to do about the Confederate monuments, we have to consider actually why they were put up and how various people feel about them. You have recently seen the controversy that happened over in Chapel Hill when the statue of Silent Sam was pulled down, and also in Durham when the Confederate soldier statue was pulled down. So I think that's really important if you're going to be teaching history, or if you live in the South and you're taking another look at some of these issues. I think it's important to understand the context in which these statues were put up and the time in which they were put up. So, we're going to go on to other statues here on Capitol Square, but these two are the most controversial. They have been defaced with black paint, just as the Confederate cemetery in Oakwood Cemetery has been defaced, and they have been cleaned numerous times to get rid of the writing. Coincidentally, I did learn that the one way the one thing that to do if you ever wanted to make a lasting impression on marble or granite is to use oil, that's something that doesn't come off. But in any case, these are the two that are controversial on Capitol Square. So we're going to go just around right next to the Confederate women's statue. There's a statue of George Washington. It's not a particularly large statue, but it's interesting in that it's a copy of the statue that appears at the Capitol building in Richmond, Virginia. Now we come to the other side of the Capitol building. The obelisk is going to be exactly opposite on the other side of the Capitol building. And this is the monument to the three presidents. And they are the three presidents that are from North Carolina. One is Polk, the other is Andrew Jackson, and then Andrew Johnson. Polk is on the left side. Andrew Jackson is on the horse. He was called the Frontier President. He's also the president that, after he was inaugurated, opened the White House to just all the citizens to come and party. And I guess the White House got trashed pretty badly. And then Andrew Johnson was one of the presidents, one of the three presidents who's been impeached. Okay, so moving right along past that one, you come to a really interesting monument to Vietnam and the soldiers that fought in Vietnam. And this one, if you ever get the chance to go to Capitol Square and look at it really closely, the detail is amazing. There are three soldiers in this. Two are trying to help a wounded soldier. And they're looking, the one guy in the middle there with the gun is looking up, and he's looking for a medevac helicopter to come in to help the wounded soldier. But the detail is so great that if you look at his bicep there, the middle guy, you can see that his shirt is rolled up, And inside that rolled up short sleeve is a pack of cigarettes, which I guess was the way that they carried their cigarettes. But it's a beautiful statue. Once a month, members of an organization that are waiting to have more accounting of those who were lost during the war meet at this site, and they read the names of those who are missing in action from the Vietnam War. Okay, so the last real monument that we're going to take a look at is a monument that honors the military services. So there's one, it's to the Army, to the Navy, to the Marine Corps, to the Air Force, etc. And it was controversial when it was first put up because people thought that the woman here was holding a tobacco leaf, and they thought that wasn't a very healthful sort of message to give. In fact, it's not a tobacco leaf, it's a palm frond, which is, I guess, a leaf on a palm tree. But it's the most recent statue that's been put up on Capitol Square. All right, so we would come around Capitol Square, and the trolley would take us down Hillsborough Street. And the first building that we're going to come to as we go down Hillsborough Street is Democratic headquarters. Well, we'll come past a couple of churches, but Democratic headquarters is interesting in that that's the way Hillsborough Street looked back in the day. There were many, many beautiful old antebellum styled homes, and Democratic headquarters is the last one that remains on Hillsborough Street. Instead, we now have what I consider to be the ugly architecture of Raleigh, and this is perhaps one of the ugliest buildings, and it is the Holiday Inn. It's been the Clarion, I believe, before, but it is the Holiday Inn, and so we won't say too much more about it as we go down Hillsborough Street. Next, we're going to come to the Dodd-Hinsdale House, which some of you might know as Second Empire. If you're going to go there for dinner, you'd want someone else to be paying because it's very, very expensive. They have a tavern downstairs that used to be cheaper, but now it's got the same menu, so it's expensive too. But the Dodd-Hinsdale House was at one point owned by the Campbell Soup heir, and it was absolutely beautiful inside. Then it was left deserted for many years, and then it was bought by the Thad-Ure family, and the Thad-Ure family owns the Angus Barn as well as other restaurants around. It has a beautiful staircase that's a reproduction because the original one was stolen, but it's a beautiful building, and it's now owned by a group of lawyers, and fortunately they've retained the architecture, so it's still with us. So besides Democratic headquarters, we've got the Dodd-Hinsdale building on Hillsborough Street. And next comes, we would be passing by Char Grill, something that you all, I'm sure, know. This is the original Char Grill before it branched out and went to other parts of the county. And at one point you had to actually go up and make your order. Now you can text message your order in and pick it up. And not to be outdone, right down the street is Snoopy's. Snoopy's has a couple of locations. Snoopy's Hot Dogs. The person that owns, has passed away, but the person who did own Snoopy's was very active politically and used to have signs up that we oftentimes disagreed with what the city council did. All right, so we're going to finish up down on Hillsborough Street, and we're going to turn right onto St. Mary's Street. And you'll have an opportunity to see St. Mary's School. St. Mary's started out as just a 2-year girls prep school. Now it is a 4-year girls high school. And but it's known for the distinction that it has is that when the capital, Richmond, Virginia, of the Confederacy was going to fall, Mrs. Jefferson Davis and the children were sent down to St. Mary's, and that's where they stayed. So the president of the Confederacy sent his family down here because he realized that Richmond was going to fall to the Union soldiers. Okay, across the street from St. Mary's Street, from St. Mary's School, is the Duncan Cameron Carriage House. And this is where, I said there were 2 large plantations in Raleigh. The first was the Mordecai Plantation. The second was the Duncan Cameron Plantation. And it starts right at the head of Hillsborough Street there. This was the carriage house. And you can see by the size of it how incredibly large it is, and the fact that they must have had a lot of carriages and a lot of horses that they put in there. This is a picture of it before it was restored. It has since been restored, and Arts Together now has art programs. It's a city art program facility, and kids go there to dance and to play music and to do art. Okay, now heading back down St. Mary Street, on your left you're going to see Wiley International Magnet Elementary School. Wiley School is currently being added on to. It is the second or third renovation of Wiley School. At one point the city was thinking they would take it down, and the cry from the citizens was so strong that they decided they would just renovate. Well, you can't really renovate much on the inside the old building, so they've tacked on a couple of newer buildings. Makes it very difficult when if you go do an observation in Wiley Elementary School for any reason, you need pebbles or you need some kind of beans to drop behind you as you go through the school, because you'll never find your way out again. There's so different elevators to go to different floors. It's very confusing. We call it the Rabbit Warren. But it's a wonderful old school, and they are renovating it, and currently I think the students will be able to return, we hope, by the end of the summer. They've been in another facility while it's being worked on. The story, though, that goes with the old Wiley School came to me from Ed Wyatt, who's no longer with us, but was head of Wyatt Quarles Seeds. And this is where Ed went to elementary school. And he said there was no cafeteria in Wiley Elementary. And so the kids would come out and they'd walk in a little line. Now we're talking about elementary school, so we got small kids. They'd walk in a little line to one of the neighbor ladies' houses. They'd walk in through her kitchen, and on the left-hand side would be a paper sack with a peanut butter sandwich in it, and on the right-hand side would be a 2-cent carton of milk. They would pick up the bag with the peanut butter sandwich, pick up their milk in a straw, and they would go sit out on the woman's front lawn to have their lunch. That was the lunchroom. It was done by a maiden lady, which was an unmarried woman in the neighborhood. So today, what's wrong with that picture? Well, if I were asking you, you would probably say no peanut butter, because we've got allergies to contend with. Nothing made by hand, because anything that comes into schools today has to be factory made and wrapped up in cellophane, etc., etc. And you would certainly want a criminal background check on the poor woman that was preparing all that food. So in many ways, you could not do that sort of thing today. But back in the day, that's how Wiley elementary children had their lunch. All right, so as we get to the head of St. Mary Street, we're going to take a left, and we're going to pass by on our right Broughton High School. It was established, it was built in 1927. It was the premier white high school in Raleigh. It is Italian Renaissance architecture. It has 3 endowed chairs, which means 3 teachers in that school, each for a period of 3 years, gets additional salary. They have to be exceptional teachers, and that money, that they were endowed with the money for that by one of their graduates who went up to New York City and made a killing on the stock exchange. He has recently passed away. His name is Richard Jenrette, and he felt so strongly about the school that he attended that he wanted to honor the teachers, not the ones that taught him, but the teachers that would follow. So that's one of the things that Broughton High School is known for. Broughton High School is also known for a case of growing marijuana in the agriculture class. Apparently the teacher didn't know what marijuana looked like. The students brought in marijuana plants, grew marijuana, and at some point were busted by the Raleigh police. And so they made the headlines for that. I will tell you that this was the premier white high school in Raleigh. The premier black high school in Raleigh was Ligon. And Ligon did not have any bus transportation for its students. And I know about Ligon because I did a study one time of the high school, and we interviewed some of the graduates of Ligon High School. And these African American citizens told us about what the school was like and the complications that they had going to that school. And one was no bus transportation. And one gentleman that we interviewed said he always picked his girlfriends based on where they lived, because he liked to walk to their house in the morning, walk to that woman's house in the morning, pick her up, walk her to school. They would go to school all day, and then he would walk her back home again. Well, if you know where Ligon is, it's way down past Moore Square. He did at one point have a girl that he really liked who lived in the Broughton area in Oberlin Village, and that romance didn't go anywhere because he just couldn't walk the four different times that length of that distance. So Broughton High School is still going today. It still has some of its sagging, uneven wooden floors. It has a very good reputation. It is an IB school, and it certainly, of course, is an integrated school. Though, one other small story, when the Murphy School was integrated with Billy Campbell, who was an elementary student, and Murphy School was an elementary school, there was also an application to integrate Broughton. And that was turned down. And I think that perhaps the reason was that there would be less trouble integrating younger children into that school than it would be getting high school students going into Broughton. I'm not sure that that's the reason, but that seems to me to be the logical reason. Okay, so we're going to pass Broughton. It'll be on our right, and we're going to come into Cameron Village. Cameron Village was the first shopping center in the South. It was opened in 1949. I've lived in Raleigh for about 50 years, and I can tell you that Cameron Village has changed its look quite a bit over time. I mean, it's gone to 3 or 4 different styles. This perhaps is one of the shops that you all might have gone to, Flying Biscuit. It's near Penzi Spices, which I would highly recommend to you. But Cameron Village was the first shopping center in the South. Okay, so we're going to come along past the Flying Biscuit, and before we get to Oberlin Road, we're going to come to Soka. And Soka has recently been in the news because of the coronavirus. It had someone who attended the conference in Boston, Biotech I think it was, that went to dinner at Soka. The owner of Soka immediately contacted everyone and immediately cleaned the restaurant, threw out all the tablecloths, got a professional cleaning crew to come in, and it was pretty spotless, and it was certainly virus-free, but nobody came to eat. And so you have servers that are not getting, they get very little to start with, but they weren't getting any tips because no one was coming to eat. You have cooks that aren't cooking. You have food that's going off. So the owner of Soka put out the word to the restaurant community. And the restaurant community stepped up, and people who owned other restaurants around Raleigh came to eat at Soka. And in fact, one that he will not mention who it was, one left a $1,000 tip for the restaurant. But it's a sign of the times that now we're doing the trolley virtually, and I can't be with you to take you on the actual trolley, and that a lot of the restaurants are seeing a diminishing service, and people are being laid off, et cetera, et cetera. So right here is where, if we were going on to NC State campus and to the roundabout, we would turn left. But I want you to think about looking to the right, and if you go down a couple of blocks, you'll come to Oberlin Village. And Oberlin Village was the premier African American community in Raleigh. 2 buildings have recently been restored by Historic Preservation Society, and you can see them right across from the little convenience store hot dog stand. They're absolutely beautiful, and I think it's ironic that they're next to some pretty ugly structures that are going up that are going to be very expensive. But there are wonderful stories about the people that lived in Oberlin Village, and in fact, the Latta School, which was established in 1892 on a block near these two restored buildings, was built in 1892, and it was for women's and men's trade classes, and it's closed in 1920, and unfortunately it was a historic site, and it burned in 2007. And so it's just a vacant lot now. But the Latta School was a premier education site for those people that wanted to learn the trades, those African Americans that wanted to learn the trades. All right, so here we come. If you were with Bobby, who's a very skillful driver and has driven with me for 20 years now, we would be going around a roundabout. This is not the NC State roundabout, but it is a roundabout. The roundabouts were put in, and the first year that roundabout was put in, there were 2 lanes going around. And that apparently was too much confusion for the people of Raleigh. And there were 89 accidents the first year. And the city council decided something had to be done. So they got rid of one of the lanes. And so now you just have to worry about people coming in from the various sides. And one of my main complaints, which you can actually see in this picture for somebody, for wherever this site is, this is not our site, but as soon as you get out of the roundabout and you get on to Pullen Road going into the campus, there's a crosswalk there. And I have seen near rear enders, I've seen students that have almost been hit. Whoever thought of that, it's beyond me. It just doesn't make any sense. But anyway, we've got roundabouts all down Hillsborough Street, and it is to keep from having stoplights and cars idling and carbon monoxide, and it's to ease traffic. And for the most part, they've been very successful. Okay, so we're coming to the bell tower. The bell tower has a very, very interesting history. First of all, it was built by the alumni of NC State. So the Alumni Association built it. And this, you can almost see in this picture that it was built in 3 parts. The granite is a little different after you get up to that first window. And anyhow, it was built in 3 parts because the Alumni Association kept running out of money. But it was built to commemorate and to honor the NC State alumni who had gone to World War I and were killed. And there's an interesting story about the plaque that was put into the tower room. Now you're actually looking at the door of the tower room right there. You can't go in without special permission or somebody who can let you in. And the tower room has a plaque on it, and the plaque lists the names of the soldiers who were NC State alum who died in World War I. And when it was being made, they got the word that George L. Jeffers. Now your notes say William. It was not. It's George. That was a mistake on my part. It's George L. Jeffers had been killed in battle, and so they engraved George L. Jeffers onto this plaque along with the other names. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, they got the word, oh no, I'm sorry, he wasn't killed. He was wounded in battle and he's in the hospital. Well, they couldn't have his name on this plaque that listed the dead. So they had to figure out what to do, and it was a very expensive plaque, so they weren't going to recast it. So what they did was, it said his name was George L. Jeffers, and that's what was on there. So if you go into the tower room and you look at the plaque, the name you will see is George E. Jefferson. So they changed the L to an E with just 2 strikes, and they put an O-N on the end. And so George L. Jefferson, George E. Jefferson is what you see. So I had always heard this story, and I didn't know whether I should believe it or not. And one semester in my 309 class, I had an ROTC student, and he said, Dr. Beal, this is really exciting. I'm going to be guarding the tower room door, and if the class comes up, this is the day our class meets, if the class comes up, I can let them look inside, and they can see if in fact the plaque does say George E. Jefferson. He said, but I don't want the whole class to come up all at once. I want you to do it like a reconnaissance thing where you just send 5 people up and then 5 more people a couple of minutes later. So it looked like make way for ducklings. We had the class in small groups walking up to the tower room, and the student led us into the tower room, and in fact, there was the name. It was George E. Jefferson, so we knew that the story was correct. Well, there's a couple more stories that go with the NC State Tower, and when the tower was finished, they could not afford to put real bells in the tower. So they thought, well, we'll just have recordings, and that's in fact what you've been hearing for any number of years since it was done. And the recordings cost money. So the way the money for the recordings was raised was the following way. It was after World War II, and the men that attended NC State, it was still all male at that point, the men that had attended NC State who had fought in World War II were on the GI Bill, and they thought it was really awful that they didn't have music, they didn't have bell sounds from the tower. At that time, the NC State basketball team called the Red Devils was really, really good, and they were playing in a very, very important basketball game. Well, they were playing not in Reynolds Coliseum, but in a building nearby, and there was not enough room for any of the townspeople to ever see any of the basketball games. So the NC State students decided they would sell their basketball tickets to that very important game to townspeople so they could raise money to put the recorded bell sounds in the tower. And that's what they did. And so everything that you have been hearing while you've been a student at NC State has been a recording of bell sounds. But the coolest thing is that it was a nod and an acknowledgement by veterans who did not die in World War II, honoring their alums, the people that preceded them, who had passed away in World War I. So it was a very cool thing. And even cooler than that now, Bill and Frances Henry, a family of NC State grads, their kids went to NC State, he went to NC State, I'm not sure if she did, have committed to buy 54 bells for the tower. So they are going to pay millions of dollars to put real bells into the tower of NC State, so that in another year or so you'll be hearing the real bells that will be ringing. Now, at the same time that they did the inspection of the tower, they found that it had been struck by lightning. So there was some damage to the interior part of the tower, and that's going to be repaired. And that's why you've seen the scaffolding in the past all around the tower. And then the plaza that's right around the base of the tower is going to be spruced up, and it will be named after the Henry family. So it's a wonderful thing that they have done. All right, so we're going to go down past the tower, and and you will see a couple of sites here. We're going to get to Holiday Hall. Holiday Hall is where the chancellor works. It's one of the oldest buildings on campus. If you come to my office, you can see a photograph of the original campus, and that's about the only building that you're going to see in that area. Okay, and so here comes the story about how did NC State get the property for the college, now a university. And it was a gentleman named Stanhope Pullen. Stanhope Pullen owned a lot of property around Raleigh, and he said there were 3 things he would never have. He would never have a dog, he would never have a wife, and he would never have an enslaved person. Well, he never married, he did have a dog, and he had a servant, and the servant's name was Walsh. And Walsh and Stanhope Pullen would walk all over Raleigh, and Walsh would carry a burlap bag and a small shovel. Stanhope Pullen would take his cane, and he'd point to a spot, and Walsh would plant an oak seedling in that spot. And so Raleigh is called the City of Oaks. It is speculated that over his lifetime, Stanhope Pullen planted 5,000 oak trees in Raleigh. Anyway, One day they were walking along in this property that you see now that Stanhope Pullen owned, and he said, I believe it's time for Raleigh to have a park, and I believe it's time for the university to have some land. So he said he had somebody harness a mule with a plow behind it, and he drew a straight line. Well, you can see from this picture, it wasn't a terribly straight line. He drew a straight line from Hillsborough Street down to where Western Boulevard would be. And he said, on the left-hand side, going down toward Western Boulevard, on the left-hand side, this will be the land I give for the park, and on the right-hand side, this will be the land that I give for the college. So NC State's original property came from Stanhope Pullen. It was bounded by Hillsborough Street on one side, Western Boulevard on the other side, and that limited how far we could grow. So if you were to continue on Pullen Road, go over the bridge and come to the traffic light and you look to your right, you're going to see the new Catholic Cathedral. And if you were to go straight ahead where they've now cut a roadway, you would come to NC State's Centennial Campus. And Centennial Campus is very interesting. It was originally the Dorothea Dix property, but it was given to NC State. This property that we now own, Centennial Campus, was given to NC State by Jim Hunt. It was at the end of his second administration at 11:59 before his term was over. Remember, you can serve 2 consecutive terms, and then he had to go out, and Jim Martin came in, the Republican governor, and then Jim Hunt came back in for 2 more terms. But at 11:59, he deeded over 2,054 acres of the Dorothea Dix property to NC State. And that was to become Centennial Campus. So we were unable to get any larger based on Hillsborough Street and Western Boulevard borders, but then we jumped over Western Boulevard and we now have Centennial Campus. What's really interesting, though, is that the city of Raleigh, for 308 acres, the rest of what was left of the Dorothea Dix property, is paying $52 million. For the land that Jim Hunt gave NC State for nothing, the value of it is $346 million. So we were given a $346 million gift by Governor Jim Hunt so that NC State could continue to grow and become Centennial Campus. So my question to you is, where do you think Jim Hunt went to school? And since all of you are incredibly clever, I know you're going to tell me NC State, and you would be right. So that's how NC State got the opportunity to grow. And so here's the Pullen Park. Sorry, I should have gone ahead. Here's Pullen Park, which was given by Stanhope Pullen. And here's a little kid on the carousel. And as we're going along here, you'll come on the left-hand side to, after you pass Pullen Park, to Central Prison. It costs probably many, many times to house somebody in Central Prison what it would cost to educate that person in the school system. But it is a high security men's prison in Raleigh. And here's the Dorothea Dix property. This is part of the original Dorothea Dix property. It was named for Dorothea Dix, who during her lifetime did not want the property named after her. During the mid-1800s, Dorothea Dix traveled around North Carolina and saw how people with mental problems were treated. Often they were tied to chairs, often they were put in closets, often they stayed in basements. They were an embarrassment to many families, and she knew that a hospital was needed for those people with mental issues, and she set about trying to convince the legislature that it needed to be built. And each time the bill was introduced, it failed. But Dorothea Dix, who was a nurse, by the way, and who actually was head of Northern Nursing in during the Civil War, stuck around, and she kept working on it. And in the interim, had a job where she nursed Representative Dobbins, or Senator Dobbins, I'm not sure which, wife, who was dying of cancer. And on Mrs. Dobbins' deathbed, she made her husband promise that he would continue Dorothea Dix's struggle to get a hospital for those who had mental issues. And when she died, her husband went right to the legislature, and he was able to get that passed. So, but the condition was it would not be named after her until after she passed away. So one other story that goes along with Dorothea Dix, and I've kind of slipped ahead one slide, but one other story that goes along with Dorothea Dix that was never mentioned when the city of Raleigh was buying the Dorothea Dix property, what was left after NC State had been given its share, was that when Sherman's troops went down, they were going down south and burning various cities. They got to Atlanta, they burned Atlanta, and the advance party was coming back, and it was going to burn Raleigh. And the city fathers spoke with the commander of the troops, and they promised that they would not do anything to disrupt the soldiers if they just wouldn't burn the city. And so he agreed. They were not going to burn the city. And even when one of the citizens of Raleigh fired a shot at the Union soldiers, and the Union soldiers went after him and hanged him because they caught him, they still did not burn the city. Instead, they camped on the Dorothea Dix property. So if you look up when you're passing the Dorothea Dix main entrance, if you look up, you'll see a hill, and that's where they camped. And the night one of the first 2 nights that they were camping there, it came down the word that the word came down that Lincoln had been assassinated. And so the troops were furious because it was a Southerner that had assassinated their president, and they massed together, and they were going to come into the city and burn it. And the commander, their general, stood in front of his troops with his cannon trained on them and his guns drawn, and told them that there would be he had given his word as an officer and a gentleman, and there would be no way that the city of Raleigh would be burned. So that, when they talk about the stories of Dorothea Dix, and they talk about her efforts for the mental hospital, etc., they don't mention the other historical part, which was that the Union troops camped on that property, and they were going to come down and burn Raleigh. All right, so now you're looking at a slide of Boylan Heights, which would coincidentally was one of the areas that the legislature, before Raleigh became a capital and they were traveling all over the state to hold the government, one of the areas that they actually came to. Now it is a very hot area that's being developed. If you look off as we cross over the bridge there, and you look off to see the new railroad station, you can see all of the development that's going on with Citrix and all of the other buildings. So we're going to come along here, we're going to take a left, and we're going to come to the Joel Lane house. Now this is not the original location of the Joel Lane house. This is the original house though, and it was moved to this site. And you can't see it, but off to the side there's a kitchen. And the kitchen was always separate from the main house. And I know if I were to ask you, being as brilliant as you are, you would be able to tell me that the reason the kitchen was separated was because there was the likelihood of fire. And because they always had a fire going in the kitchen. And the last thing you wanted to do, you could burn down the kitchen, but you didn't want to burn down the whole house. Now, in front of the kitchen is an herb garden. And I would ask you, what was the use of the herb garden back in the day? And you would say to flavor the food, etc., etc. Well, it was a little more serious than that. It actually was, with very strong herbs, you were able to hide the taste of food that had just gone off. Now, food was very expensive, and people, just as it was about ready to go bad, didn't want to have to throw it away. So they would use very strong herbs to flavor the food so that their guests wouldn't taste it, that it was tasted a little off. And then they just hoped that when the guests went home, they didn't spend the whole night throwing up. Now, I had a graduate student that actually looked into the herbs that were grown in northern gardens and the herbs that were grown in southern gardens, and she found that the herbs that were grown in southern gardens were much stronger in flavor than the herbs that were grown in northern gardens. And the reason for this is that because they had the ice, that the lakes would freeze over, they could cut ice and they could keep things refrigerated up north, things that couldn't be refrigerated down south. They didn't have to use really strong herbs to cover the flavor of food that was just going off. So down south, we might have been remiss in serving the food, but we were smart enough to have a very strong herb to cover up the bad taste. All right, so now we're going to go around the corner and we're going to go past the Citrix building, and we're going to go into the main part of downtown Raleigh. And this is the Avery Upchurch government building. Avery Upchurch was a mayor of Raleigh for 4 or 5 times. He was what you probably would have called a good old boy. He was a farm boy, often wore those jeans that had the bib overall type jeans to work. And when you're coming up Glenwood Avenue and you turn onto Oberlin Road, the Exxon station there was Avery owned that particular station. But anyway, he was a very good mayor, and he did not discriminate against black citizens or white citizens. When parts of Raleigh were being developed, he pretty much spread the money out equally. And so this is the Avery Upchurch government building. So then we would come along and we would pass we're going to pass Moore Square, which is on the left-hand side. I'm sorry, we're going to pass Nash Square, which is on the left-hand side. And if you were on the trolley, you would see that there's a statue in there to firemen, and it coincidentally happens to be that statue happens to be across the street from Fire Station number 1. So we're going to go up and we're going to take a left, and we're going to come down to the new Civic Center, and you're going to see the new amphitheater, the Red Hat Amphitheater. And here is the Civic Center, and you can see the shimmer wall. Raleigh doesn't do a particularly good job with public art. There's very little of it, but the shimmer wall is really beautiful. There are thousands and thousands of metal plates, discs, small squares that are adhering to the side of that wall to make that picture. And then, but because they're only attached by one brad or one nail, when the wind blows, they can blow. And so if it's a windy day and you come and you stand here and you look at the shimmer wall, you're going to see the tree swaying and the branches swaying and the leaves swaying. It's really lovely. At night, it's oftentimes lit from below by various colored lights. So it's a very pretty piece of public art. All right, and then we're going to go up the hill and we're going to take a right, and you're coming to the Civic Center. This is the new Civic Center. Well, it's new within the past 10 years. The old Civic Center used to be across the street. It was a horrible, horrible building. It blocked the view from Memorial Auditorium to the Capitol building. They decided to take it down, and the new Civic Center was put up. And outside of the Civic Center, you'll see Sir Walter Raleigh. Sir Walter Raleigh happens to be celebrating Gay Pride Week in this particular picture. But he, of course, as I said before, never came to Raleigh, never came to the New World, but we used his name for our capital. Okay, Raleigh is the city of oaks. Stanhope Pullen planted 5,000 oak trees, or oak seedlings, so that we would have oak trees all over the city. And so when the bicentennial came in 1992, we were 1792 that we became the capital, named Raleigh. In 1992, it was 200 years. We celebrated the bicentennial. An artist in Raleigh erected this lovely acorn. And the acorn is 250 times the size of a regular acorn. It weighs half a ton. It measures 8 feet by 10 feet. And one of the pieces of the cap of the acorn comes from the original Capitol dome. So you've got some copper up there too. The coolest thing about it, though, well, first of all, the artist who built it in his basement. And it's like that typical story of don't build a boat in your basement because you can't get it out. He had to take down a wall in his house an exterior wall to be able to get this out. But anyway, when it arrived at its location, which originally was Moore Square, but it is now by Memorial Auditorium. When it arrived at its original location, it was brought in a truck, so that you could see it, and somebody was driving the truck, and the person was wearing a squirrel's costume, so it looked like a squirrel was driving a truck with a big acorn in the back, and it was preceded by 50 fellows riding Harley Davidsons. So it was a great big deal to have this acorn installed in Moore Square. However, now if you're looking at Memorial Auditorium, and you'll see Mamandi Concert Hall on one side, and you'll see the Opera House on the Opera Center on the other, you would be looking at the acorn on the right-hand side of the picture if it were in the picture. Memorial Auditorium. Memorial Auditorium actually is the site of the second governor's mansion. Now, the first governor's mansion was a log cabin. The second governor's mansion was on this site, but when the Union soldiers came up, camped on the Dorothea Dix property, and messed around with Raleigh, they took over the second governor's mansion, and they pretty much trashed it, pretty much the way Andrew Jackson's folks trashed the White House after he was inaugurated. And after the Union troops left, the people in Raleigh determined they did not want their governor living in a place where the Union troops had been. So the land became available, and Memorial Auditorium was built. It was built in 1910 primarily to have a meeting place, a big meeting place for all the legislative members to be. And it was enlarged in 1913. In 1930, it burned. So it's interesting. The Capitol burned in 1830. Memorial Auditorium burned in 1930. And immediately they started to try to move the Capitol again because you wouldn't have a big place where everybody could meet. But they didn't, and they rebuilt as a WPA project, and that was a project that allowed artists during the recession, to be able to have jobs. And it was rebuilt as a WPA project, and coincidentally NC State played basketball in Memorial Auditorium for 2 years. And if you were to look in Memorial Auditorium now with the gorgeous crystal chandeliers, you'd wonder how that could ever have happened. I doubt that the chandeliers were there then. So you've got Mamandi Concert Hall, and you've got the Fletcher Opera Theater one on either side. That itself was controversial. They thought it was going to spoil the look of Memorial Auditorium. It does not. And if you stand with your back to the columns of Memorial Auditorium and you look straight up, you will see the Capitol building. So by taking down the old convention center, we are able to liberate the view from Memorial Auditorium to the Capitol building. All right, so driving right along, we would come to Shaw University. It was built in 1865. It was originally called the Raleigh Institute. It was the first co-ed higher education, African-American building in university or college at the time in the United States. This is 1874, and it is Estes Hall. It was originally a dormitory. It has been beautifully restored and is now used as an administrative building for Shaw University. Shaw has a big Middle Eastern presence, and in fact, I have friends who teach at Shaw University, and they say that students from the Middle East who are here regularly come up and ask them before exams and before final grades are in what kind of gold jewelry they would like to have as a gift. And they immediately say, of course, I'm sorry, but we can't accept anything like that. There is a building on the Shaw University campus that is a building for Middle Eastern Studies, which has been paid for and is supported by a couple of countries in the Middle East. All right, so then we're going to turn left, and we're going to go up toward Moore Square. And before we get to Moore Square, you'll come to the Old Farmers Market. And this is a very faded mural. When it was first done, it was brilliant, but it's a faded mural of some of the agricultural leaders in North Carolina back in the day. And the farmers market was on the other side. Okay, so we're coming to Moore Square, and here's the the schematic drawing of the new Moore Square. Moore Square was one of those 4 squares that was to remain public. 2 of them have remained public. Nash, the one for the firefighters, and Moore Square. The other 2, one became the parking lot for Jesse Helms's law firm, and the other one, Burke Square, became where the governor's mansion is, and we're going to go past that in just a moment. But this is the scheme, the drawing for the new Moore Square. And as we pass Moore Square, and if you were to really look closely off to your left, and you could see it now because the leaves are not on the tree. All right, stop for a water break. Let's get back to Haywood Hall. He was the first treasurer of North Carolina, and he was passionately in love with a beach woman. And she said to him, "Honey, I am not moving up to that cow town of Raleigh unless you build me a beautiful big house." And he was so in love with her that he did. And so Haywood Hall was built. It's used for, it is open on Thursdays, right around lunchtime. It really doesn't stay open very much. Owned by the Colonial Dames. Here you can see it's set up. This picture shows it's set up for a wedding. It is a beautiful, beautiful house. Margie Haywood, when we did the bicentennial in 1992, Margie Haywood was the head of the education committee, and I was the consultant to the city for activities around Raleigh to celebrate the bicentennial. And Margie Haywood was a force with which to be reckoned. She was that damn the torpedoes full speed ahead. You just didn't get in her way. And we have some really interesting stories of things that we did. But Haywood Hall was her pride and joy. Even though it was owned by the Colonial Dames, she headed up Haywood Hall, and she, for her whole lifetime, was involved in getting things back to Haywood Hall that had originally been in Haywood Hall. So this is a nod to the first treasurer of North Carolina and to a very dear friend of mine, Margie Haywood, who passed a few years ago. Now, the descendants of Haywood, not the treasurer, but the descendants, one was the head of the medical, was head of medical, was head of the during the Civil War, was head of the medical services, and he was a very, very well-known surgeon, and he was very well known for being able to put ligaments back together again. And if you'll think about the size of the balls that were fired, the bullets that were fired back in the day during the Civil War, you'll know that the wounds were gaping wounds, and the interior damage was extreme. But he was very good at being able to sew people back together again. Also, he was the first to ever do a cesarean section, and he was the first to ever use anesthesia, thank the Lord. But he was very, very well known, and he was very famous. And whether they were Union troops or they were Confederate troops, if they were Union troops, he would pay for their rail fare back up to the north, because oftentimes they didn't have the money to go back home again. All right, so now we are coming to the governor's mansion. The governor's mansion, this is the third governor's mansion. The first was the log cabin. The second was where Memorial Auditorium is now, was used by the Union troops as their headquarters, and so we weren't going to use that again. So this one, was put on Burke Square. Shouldn't have been put there. It should be a public square, but that didn't seem to matter. It is as much as possible built from North Carolina products. So the wood inside is North Carolina wood. All the brickwork was made by inmates in the prison, and the walkway, the building itself is brick. The walkway is also brick. And if you're going along the front of the building on the sidewalk, you're going to see some bricks that have names on them. And here are 2 examples of bricks that have names on them. So if we were on the trolley, I would ask you now why some of the bricks have names and why some do not have names. And again, being just as clever as you are, I know you would tell me that probably what happened was when the inmates were making bricks each day, they were asked to make a pile of how many bricks they had completed. And they put one brick up at the top, and they wrote their name in that particular brick, so that as the supervisor came by to see who had done which pile, he was able to see which pile was done by which inmate. Well, they would seem to be terribly wasteful if you didn't use them, so they fired all the bricks and they put them all in the walkway. You see a few in the sidewalk in front of the governor's mansion. If you go through the gates and you go up into the mansion, you'll see many more in that particular area. And I always wondered why somebody hadn't pried some out or tried to take them. But you can't see it in this picture, but there are cameras, of course, all over the front entrance of the governor's mansion. There are a couple of stories that go along with the governor's mansion. Governor Scott was a very tall governor, and he actually was a professor at NC State. Governor Scott was a very tall governor, and he removed the bed that Governor Fowle installed. Governor Fowle was the first person to be able to stay in the governor's mansion, and he had a shorter bed. Governor Scott was uncomfortable with that bed, so he had it taken out and put in archives and history storage room. And when Governor Scott and his wife would retire for the evening, and they would be reading up in their bedroom, they would often hear 3 or 4 knocks on the wall of their bedroom. And they determined later that it must have been the ghost of Governor Fowle, who was wanting to know where his bed had gone. One other really interesting fact about the governor's mansion, and this includes today, the governor is served by inmates that are on work release, and so the people that cook, the people that do the grounds, the people that do the cleaning, everyone that is working around the governor except for staff are people that are inmates from the prison. So if we pass by the governor's mansion and we go into Oakwood, you're going to see a beautiful housing area where there are covenants in that particular area. At one point, the people that lived in Oakwood thought that a superhighway was coming through, and in one instance it was planned for that. And so they decided to all get together and incorporate themselves so that could not happen. And so when you go through Oakwood, you'll see homes that are maybe being renovated or being repainted or whatever. Everything that's being done has to get permission from the society, the Oakwood Society, to be able to make changes in the houses. It needs to stay as true to the original house as possible. Well, we're going to come down and we're going to pass Oakwood Cemetery. And one of the activities that you're going to have, since we aren't going to be able to go to Oakwood Cemetery, you'll have a special day where you will go to Oakwood Cemetery's website and you'll do some activities. But this is the entrance to Oakwood Cemetery. Oakwood Cemetery has Moses Mordecai gave the land for the Confederate Cemetery. There are 3 cemeteries. There's Oakwood Cemetery, there's the Confederate Cemetery, and there's the Hebrew Cemetery. There are very famous people buried here. You'll have a piece that you'll read that'll talk about that there are 7 governors that are buried here. Jim Valvano is buried here. Jesse Helms is buried here. Margie Haywood is buried there, the Haywood family. Wade and Elizabeth Edwards are buried there. It is a beautiful, beautiful cemetery, and you are certainly welcome to tour it on your own. They do have tours, and if you're lucky, you'll get Robin Simonton, who's the director of Oakwood Cemetery and who was going to do our tour, and she will tell you all kinds of incredible stories about Oakwood Cemetery. When I was teaching preschool, I did have a family in my preschool class, and the dad had just finished his doctorate at UNC, and he was diagnosed with cancer. And before the school year ended, unfortunately, he passed away. And I went to the funeral, and he was buried in the Hebrew Cemetery in Oakwood Cemetery. And I was very interested to see that on all the headstones in the Hebrew Cemetery, or most of them, there were small pebbles that went right across the top of the tombstone. And I later asked somebody about that because I didn't know what that meant. And the person told me that it was to let the person that had passed away, who was looking down from above, know that people still remembered that person and they were thinking about him or her. And I thought it was just a lovely tradition. Now so that was a story from the Hebrew cemetery. The Confederate cemetery is interesting, and if you were to drive around in Oakwood Cemetery or visit, you would find that all the headstones are the same. They're all white marble, and they just have the person's rank and the person's name on it, and perhaps where they served. I'm not sure, but at one point in Raleigh, all of the Confederate dead who were buried in other graveyards in Raleigh were all dug up, and they were all brought to the Confederate cemetery. So most of the people are the people that we know about that fought in the Civil War and died serving, fighting for the South, are buried in the Confederate cemetery. The Confederate cemetery is somewhat of a headache for Oakwood Cemetery because it is often vandalized. And just recently, within the past 3 or 4 years, they had to do a great cleaning job in getting paint off of the headstones. When asked if Silent Sam could ever be moved to the Confederate cemetery, Oakwood said no. They have to pay a lot of money right now just to guard the cemetery and be on the alert for people that want to deface stones, that they didn't want to have to shoulder that also. So Silent Sam is still a struggle that we haven't finished with. Okay, but in Oakwood Cemetery, you will find the grave of Jim Valvano. He was the coach when NC State won the national championship in 1983. He was the coach, and he's famously known for being so excited when the last game was over. He was running around the court trying to find somebody to hug. And this is a very many times visited grave. He always talks about never giving up, and he never did give up. As a matter of fact, his daughter was in the NC State MSL program. She taught for a number of years, but she now works with the V Foundation to raise money to fight cancer. Down the hill and facing, down the hill and Tuffy, the stone on the right, Tuffy is facing the Valvano stone, is the grave of Lorenzo Charles. Lorenzo Charles was the basketball player who caught the pass that really wasn't supposed to be a basket, but caught the pass under the basket and made the basket that won the championship for NC State. Lorenzo Charles was a bus driver. He was coming off of he was coming off of a road getting down to I-40, and his bus went out of control, and he was killed when his bus crashed. The supporters of NC State athletics bought the grave site for Lorenzo Charles and also paid for the monument to be put up. But the stipulation was that it had to be within sight of Jim Valvano's grave, since they had played together and worked together. We come to two more very, very famous monuments at Oakwood Cemetery. The one on the left is an angel, a mourning angel, and this angel is mourning the death of Wade Edwards. If you look very closely, you can see Wade's face. She's got her hand on the side of it there. You can see Wade's face. He's on the left. Elizabeth Edwards is on the right. Wade Edwards was the son of John Edwards, and Elizabeth Edwards was the wife of John Edwards. John Edwards served in Congress and ran for president. Wade Edwards was killed as he was driving to the beach. He was in a Suzuki Samurai. The winds whipped across, knocked the car off the road, and he died. His mother grieved him terribly. She would sit at his gravesite all through what would have been his senior year at Broughton High School, had he been living, and she would read aloud the texts and the novels that he was supposed to read as a senior. This monument weighs many tons. Wade's grave, actually, the coffin had to be moved so that it was not on top of it because it weighs so much. But it was done on Meredith College campus, And Elizabeth Edwards supervised the chiseling and the building of this monument, and she would have her sister climb up a ladder to make sure that the face in the lap of the angel looked like Wade. So it shows just how deeply she grieved for this child. She herself died of cancer, and the same sculptor did her monument. It is of doves of peace being released from two hands that are down below, and you'll see there is a trail of vines of ivy, and that connects this monument, which is right next to it, to the other monument, and that ivy represents the connection between loved ones. She told Robert Mahaley, who was the sculptor of hers as well as Wade's, that that's what she wanted, and she told him that just prior to dying. Robert Mahaley also was one of the premier sculptors on the Washington Cathedral in Washington, D.C. All right, so we're going out of Oakwood Cemetery now, and we're going to go almost up to St. Augustine's University, and we're coming to St. Agnes. St. Agnes Hospital has a very interesting history. It is in ruins now, but as you can see, if you look closely, there are some steel bars that allow it to remain intact so that it's not crumbling and falling down on itself. It was a hospital for black citizens. It was during the time of Jim Crow, when black citizens could not be served by white hospitals. And so there are many stories of unfortunate deaths where someone who was injured would be going past a white hospital a black person who was injured would go past a white hospital and would not be able to be helped and would not make it to the black hospital. But this hospital was for nurses training. It was established in 1896. There was a fire in 1904. It was reconstructed in 1909. And in 1940, it was bought from St. Augustine's University. And then it closed in 1961 when Wake Med was opened, and of course Wake Med was integrated, so there was no longer a need for a black hospital on that site. And it just kind of has fallen into disrepair. It is a stunning building, particularly if you see it at night and you see the lights of St. Aug's shining through the building itself. I've been at Oakwood Cemetery in the evening and seen that same site, and it is just haunting. It's just beautiful. They've talked about restoring it, but in restoring it, they would want to just make it look like a regular building. So, and they've raised money, but it's always disappeared. So I'm not sure what's happened to it, and I guess I'm just as glad that as long as it's stabilized, that it's staying the way it is. All right, so we are now at St. Augustine's University. It was established in 1867. It was for those people who had been enslaved and were now free, and 2/3 of the property was left fallow, which meant that the students could farm in that property so that they would be able to afford their tuition. Reverend Delaney was the first president of St. Aug's, and he had 2 daughters, both of whom left the state of North Carolina to go to New York City during the Jim Crow years because they knew they wouldn't have chances down here that they would have up in the north. One became a dentist, and the other became a teacher. Their archives actually have been sent down to St. Aug's, but they're kept in storage because they can't afford to do anything with them right now. Okay, and so we're just about near to the end of the trolley trip. This is the Murphy School, and this Murphy School was the first school that was integrated in Raleigh. It was integrated by Billy Campbell on September 9th, 1960, and as I said before, they had tried to integrate Broughton High School with 2 applications for 2 high school students, but they were turned down, and Billy Campbell was allowed to integrate. Billy Campbell went on to be the mayor of Atlanta. He also went on to serve as a resident in a prison in Atlanta for some things that were done during his administration that he was convicted of. But the Campbell family was very, very influential in the civil rights movement in Raleigh. And his brother Ralph Campbell went on to serve in North Carolina government. But at one point they thought they would tear down the Murphy School. And again, it was like the Wiley School. There was enough of a cry about doing that they kept it. And so now those people who are chronologically gifted, there are apartments for them in the Murphy School. So as my children tell me, I could always live in the Murphy School. All right, so our final stop is going to be Krispy Kreme donuts. Krispy Kreme is a North Carolina business. It was started actually in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Vernon Randolph, who was from Kentucky, bought the recipe from a New Orleans chef. I don't know if they're like beignets or not, but bought the recipe from a New Orleans chef. And he moved to Winston-Salem. He had a 1936 Pontiac that he was driving. He had $200. He had donut making equipment, and he had the secret recipe, and he had the name Krispy Kreme. And he didn't have enough money to buy the materials. Once he rented a place, he didn't have enough money to buy the materials to make the donuts. So he made a deal with the merchant that he would give him some of his profits if he would help him with the flour and the sugar and everything that he needed. And in addition, so all the donuts that were made were actually delivered to grocery stores around Winston-Salem. And people kept trying to come to buy donuts from the factory or his little building where he had his equipment set up. And he got so tired of answering the door and saying, "No, I don't sell from this building, go to the grocery store," that he knocked a window out of the building, and it was the first drive-up service in North Carolina, and he started selling his donuts from the window in that particular building. If you were on the trolley now, you would be being driven by Bobby Jordan, who is from Winston-Salem, and I would be asking Bobby to tell the story about his childhood growing up in Winston, and he would tell you that Vernon Randolph's place was right near Old Salem, and that his family lived near Old Salem, and every time they went into town, into that area, they would have the chance to buy either some ice cream or a donut. And he would tell you that in the summertime he always bought ice cream, and in the wintertime he always bought donuts. But the most fun was when donuts were on the menu at his school. And then you would trade everything you had to get an extra donut for lunch. Now, I don't know that he would trade his little brother or sister, but he made lots of deals swapping so that he could get a donut for lunch. All right, so that's our last slide from the Great Raleigh Trolley Adventure. I know you're going to take a look at what we've said about it, but again, the whole purpose is to try to answer the question, who am I? What's my place in the world? So if you have a pretty good sense of yourself, a lot of that comes from the community and the area in which you live, and the history that you know. And so I really think it's important for teachers to, when they go to teach in a particular area, to know the community, know where their kids are coming from, and know what that community is known for, because you are the keeper of the history, and your students will be the keeper of the history. So I'm very sorry that I could not stand up and lurch as the trolley went back and forth throughout the city and tell you these stories, but I hope you've enjoyed them, and I look forward to seeing you again sometime on the trolley. Bye. So we've got one more, it's a little small part, and it's an add-on that I wanted to share with you. You'll remember when we went to the art museum, I talked about the painting of the donkey that was coming into the town square. And it's housed in the Russian Museum. So this is the Mykolaievsky Palace in St. Petersburg, Russia. This is the Russian Museum. And I've got 3 pictures that I've taken at different spots in the gallery to show you what I think shows the donkey turning in different directions. So we're going to start off on the left side of the picture. I'm standing with a very good friend of mine here, and you can see the donkey is coming straight at us. All right, so then we're going to go over to more the middle of the picture, And it sure looks to me like the donkey's changed direction and is coming this way at us. And you can't see, I'm doing hand motions so that I can tell you, but you can't see it, of course. And so then we're looking at standing over in the very far part of the picture, and there's the donkey turning from going off to the right of the picture to coming toward you on the left of the picture. So there you go. I wanted to share that with you. I found it when I was looking for the slides for Raleigh, and that's the end of the Great Raleigh Trolley Adventure. Thank you very, very much.